Hey, biology. Let's talk about cellular respiration and tie cellular respiration to ATP and fermentation and what the heck is anaerobic? What does that mean? It all comes down to this beautiful and amazing molecule that we like to call ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate, it has this one group that I'm not going to draw the chemical structure for because I don't want to. Because all you really need to know is that this is the adenine group, and that's the same adenine that's in RNA and DNA. It's then bonded to a ribose sugar, which makes it, if this was going to go into DNA or RNA, it would have to go into RNA because it's a ribose and not a deoxyribose. And then ATP is going to be bonded to, that T means tri. So adenosine triphosphate. Like that. Not try as in try your best, but try as in three. And so that means it's bounded to 3 phosphate groups, like so. And if you remember from chemistry, I know we all do, those phosphate groups have a -4 charge. -4? -3? I don't remember. I think it's -3. -3 charge. I think I might have said -4 in class, whatever. All you really need to know is that this is an incredibly large negative charge, and then you shoved another really large negative charge right next to it, and then a third really large negative charge. So the energy it took to make this bond happen must be really great, because you're shoving a bunch of negatives together, and so you're basically, we can use ATP, or we do, our body uses ATP as an energy currency molecule, meaning it takes ATP and it distributes it throughout the entire body. Wherever something happens that needs energy, it's happening with ATP, because when we break these bonds, we have this overall exothermic reaction where the breaking of the bonds provides energy that can then be used in other reactions. So the way that this happens is that you have water coming in, and it does hydrolysis. And so what that does is it comes in here, and it breaks that bond. And the result of that is ADP. So we could call this ATP. You could either call it ATP or draw it out. And then it creates ADP. Okay, that's adenosine diphosphate. Di is 2, not, the opposite of living, but di as in 2. And if you were to draw that out, it'd be A with a ribose, and then 2 phosphate groups. Pew, pew. So still pretty negative, but definitely less negative than this charge was. And then, but you can't just leave it hanging. So what else? Because of conservation of mass, whatever you wrote over here has to be written over here. So we have that phosphate group, this guy that popped off or was broken off by water. You can write that as just inorganic phosphate. And then what else? Oh, well, the breaking of that bond allowed an overall exothermic reaction to occur. So we get energy released, which can then, or energy is, I don't know that we technically talk about it, but energy is then made available to be used to do other stuff, okay? So we have all this ATP floating around so that when we need to flex our muscles, we have to have ATP to allow us to then relax our muscles. It's the lack of ATP that leads to rigor mortis. So if you don't have ATP molecules, you cannot relax your muscles. So rigor mortis happens because you, after you die, you run out of ATP and your muscles will never relax until bacteria start breaking them down. So there's that. That's one example of how ATP is used. There's so many. Any kind of movement requires ATP, digestion requires ATP, building muscles, building bones, building your liver, all of that stuff requires ATP to be present so that you'll have energy to be used. Okay, so that's how we break down ATP. This process is a form of hydrolysis because water breaking something is hydrolysis, but this is specifically called phosphorylation. Phosphorylation. This is a phosphorylation reaction. Okay, really, because what happens is that phosphate can then go do something. Awesome. Okay, cool. So that's all well and good that ATP is used to transport energy around the body so it can be used all the time. It's basically like an awesome gift card that can always be used. But then how do you fill that gift card? How do you make ATP? And that is to make ATP. Making ATP happens through cellular respiration. ATP happens, there's some singing for you, through cellular respiration. respiration. And there's two flavors. When we just kind of generally talk about cellular respiration, we're talking about the human version, which tends to almost always be aerobic. Okay, so we have two flavors. If there is, and we're going to go into this in more detail, but the steps of cellular respiration are step 1, glycolysis, and we'll talk about what that means. And then where this is happening, the reaction can go one of two ways. You can then say, this reaction has to make, it doesn't make a decision, but it has to consider, is oxygen present? If yes, then you're going to go through aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration, which means then you're going to do step 2, which is the Krebs cycle, and then step 3, which is the electron transport chain. Okay? If no, you're going to go through anaerobic respiration. Respiration. And that is just fermentation. But the thing that has to happen first is glycolysis. And when glycolysis happens, you're breaking down a sugar. Usually it's glucose. Okay, and that's basically the only one, because glycolysis means, glycolysis means to break down the sugar. You're breaking that down into pyruvate, or pyruvic acid, same thing. And you will, while this is happening, and it's actually 2 of those, this at the same time, because when glucose breaks down, you have these free electrons that need to go somewhere, okay? And fortunately, we have this electron transporter called NADH. It's really NADH+. And it takes those extra electrons that are being produced and some hydrogen, because there's always hydrogen around, NADH, and becomes NADH. So fermentation, one of the biggest things about fermentation is it takes that NADH and it breaks it back down to NAD+, okay? Which then can be used in glycolysis again. Because if you don't have NAD, you can't get through glycolysis, okay? And why do we even care about glycolysis at all if we're going to go through fermentation? Well, another thing glycolysis does is it takes those ADPs that need to be refilled and adds, there's just one of the byproducts, one of the secondary reactions that's happening, or I guess it's happening at the same time, is ATP is produced, okay? ADP becomes ATP. How many do we get? We get 2 NADHs are produced. We get 2 ATPs produced. Okay, that's all. There's 0 ATPs produced in fermentation. So there's no more energy molecules produced in fermentation. You just go through this cycle over and over. If you're a bacteria, that could be all you need. Okay, there could be some secondary reactions that are happening if you are going through fermentation of lactose. Then you're also going to get lactic acid coming out. And that's when we started talking about enzymes. So the thing that makes this happen is called lactase. If you don't have lactase, then you are lactose intolerant. And then our gut bacteria, takes advantage. It's kind of like the kid who sees you eating a hamburger and is like, hey, you're going to eat those fries, and reaches over and steals the fries before you can get them. But the problem is that when you make lactic acid, you oftentimes produce other things like CH4 or methane, which are then disastrous in our gut. They lead to things like lots of flatulence or diarrhea, that kind of thing. So this is lactic acid fermentation. There's also alcoholic fermentation. There's so many kinds of fermentation. The point being fermentation. The point being that you still get no ATP produced. You get alcohol or ethanol as a byproduct, which then humans like, some humans, and also lots of monkeys. But the big point of fermentation is that NADH goes back to being NAD+, so you can go back into glycolysis and get that going over and over. But again, the deciding factor for are you going to go through fermentation or are you going to go through the rest of aerobic respiration is there oxygen present? Okay, if there is oxygen present, you go through the cellular respiration that we're used to talking about. If not, you go through anaerobic respiration. Okay, cool. So let's talk a lot more about anaerobic respiration using that big, pretty map that we've been looking at. I don't know if it's a map. That big, pretty picture. This guy. Dun, dun, dun. So let's make sure everyone has all the same stuff going on here. I wonder if I can zoom out more. I bet I can. Boom. Better. Okay. So what's happening? The general equation for cellular respiration. So once you kind of add all these individual equations together and you get rid of multiples, et cetera, or things on either side of the equation, you end up with glucose, or some sugar. You could also write that as C6H12O6, plus oxygen, so that makes this aerobic, is going to result in carbon dioxide plus water. The thing is this, so if you look at this, you might think, and it's not balanced, I know, it's all good. You look at this and you're like, oh my God, that is combustion. It's so cool. But the thing is, it happens in different steps. It's not happening in just one reaction like setting something on fire is when you're talking about chemical combustions. So, or the kinds you talked about in chemistry before. So let's go step by step. So the very first step of cellular respiration is glycolysis, like we said. Glycolysis. Okay, and let's keep track of our carbons. So the first thing we're doing is we are breaking down glucose through several steps, and the outcome are 2 pyruvic acids, or pyruvates, which I write because it's easier. Awesome. But remember, that's not the only thing that happens. The other thing that happens is that you also need some NADHs. NADs, which then make 2 NADHs. Okay, awesome. You also need ADP to pick up some extra energy that's happening to produce 2 ATPs. So our count right now for ATPs is 2. So if you were just to go from there, all of a sudden there's no oxygen, you don't take that pyruvate into the mitochondria at all. It just goes into someplace else, maybe in the cytoplasm, and it goes through fermentation. It doesn't make any more ATPs. You're left with just 2. That we can do better in the presence of oxygen, which is great. You can ignore this box. Okay, we can say, so then pyruvate moves into the mitochondria. Moves into mitochondria. Okay, specifically in the matrix. So this inner part is called the matrix, okay? All of this matrix. Not like Keanu Reeves' Matrix. Much more exciting. Okay, so in the matrix, we go into step 2, the Krebs cycle. No apostrophe. Krebs cycle. It's also called the citric acid cycle. You can use whichever one you want. I like saying Krebs. Again, it's only one syllable. Okay, so then we take that pyruvate. So really 2 pyruvates were made. We're just going to follow 1 for right now. So that pyruvate through, again, another, I don't like having a V and a U next to each other. Pyruvate gets broken down into 3 carbon dioxides. Okay, so the carbon dioxide then diffuses out. We don't need carbon dioxide in anything else happening here. Carbon dioxide acts as a really good buffer in your blood system. In the cell, it's just waste product. So it leaves, it's gone forever. We don't need it for anything, which means we're done with the carbons in this, okay? The carbons from glucose have all now been used up. Awesome, okay? So what else is happening? Well, we also have NADH, okay, which means Krebs cycle also requires, let's write this. Krebs cycle also does, okay, where am I going to write this? Here we go. We also have NAD going to NADH. And we also get this other guy, FAD, being turned into FADH. So again, when you're taking pyruvate and you're breaking it down into 3 carbon dioxides, you end up with a whole bunch of electrons that need someplace to go. NAD and FAD are around to soak up those electrons, and that causes hydrogen to bind also. And then it turns out the fact that these molecules are around is very handy. FADH2. Because now all of the NADHs and all of the FADHs, all of these guys go into the electron transport chains. Okay? Because these are electron transporting molecules. So they go to step 3, the electron transport chain. Electron transport chain. Awesome. And so they get recycled, okay? So this happens in the intermembrane space. Membrane space. So this isn't just a really chunky rind of a mitochondria. This is open space, okay? And what really is happening is you have these little poor molecules here, and they're moving that NAD and FADH2, NADH and FADH2. They're causing electrons to pop off and move through these into this space, and that causes a relief of the, it's moving with the concentration gradient, and anytime you move with the concentration gradient, you don't need energy, and in some cases you can actually, it's mostly exothermic, so you're producing energy, and that just so happens there's a whole bunch of ADPs around here, and a whole bunch of phosphates, and so they can take that energy that's being produced, energy plus all that, and they can produce ATP. Okay, and they also happen to produce water. So look, that's the exact reverse reaction of what we started with, right? So we started with ATP getting broken down by water into ADP, a phosphate, and the release of energy. Well, then we have all this ADP we need to use and a bunch of, sad, lonely orphan phosphate groups. Well, they go to the mitochondria and they get soaked up into the electron transport chain, most of them, because, oh, I forgot to mention, because it's barely worth mentioning, but the Krebs cycle also produces 2 ATP. So through the glycolysis in the Krebs cycle, we get a big old whopping 4 ATPs. For one glucose molecule, that might not sound bad, but this electron transport chain, where you get this relief of the concentration gradient, where everything's building up like crazy here, and it just wants to move to where it's less concentrated so it can spread out. Yay! That relief of that, it's called chemiosmosis, that relief of that concentration gradient produces 34 ATP. And some books give different numbers, as long as you're in the right kind of range of like glycolysis being very, very low, Krebs cycle being very, very low, and then the electron transport chain being super high, you're going to be right, okay? So because this requires NADH, okay, so add this, let me have it this right. So this requires NADH and FADH2. Let's write more over here. It produces NAD and FAD. Cool. Well, there's those gonna go? Well, FAD gets taken back over to the Krebs cycle. Some of that NAD gets taken back to the Krebs cycle. Some of that NAD also goes into the cytoplasm and can be used for glycolysis again. So it's this beautiful constant cycle, and the end things go back to the beginning things help produce all the energy. It's beautiful. It's 3 steps. Make sure you know what comes out of each step. Oh, where's oxygen required? Oh no, wait, we forgot. This ADP ATP thing, this has to happen in the presence of oxygen. So this also requires oxygen. And it produces water. Also makes water. So let's make sure we covered all the things that are here. So glucose is used in glycolysis, so step 1. Oxygen is used in step 3. Step 3. CO2 is produced in step 2, so the Krebs cycle, and then water is produced in step 3. So we've covered our general equation. Everything has been accounted for. We also know that this is also at the same time producing, and the reason why it's not in this equation, we have a whole bunch of NADs becoming NADH, and we have some FADs, a whole bunch of FADs, plus 2, becoming FADH2. But you also see them going the reverse reaction, okay? So they go this way in steps 1 and 2, and then they go back in step 3, okay? So that's why these are not included in this reaction, because they go both directions, okay? We do also know that this produces a whole lot of ATP, okay? So we have a whole lot of ADP that's required, okay? So we get 2 ADPs plus some phosphates going to ATP plus water in steps 1 and 2, so we get 2 of that, giving you 2 ATPs, 2 of those. I'm not going to balance that. So this happens in steps 1 and 2. 1 and 2. And then it's in step 3 where we have ADP plus PI going to ATP plus water, happening 34 times, okay? So it's that electron transport chain which is giving you most of those ATP molecules. Remember also, this step is going to require energy input. Energy, hello, input has to happen here. So that makes this reaction, because the energy is on the reactant side, is endothermic. And that means that over here, where we're getting a release, energy must be, wait, I did this backwards. Yes, I did. Don't listen to me. Do listen to me. Just note that I did it backwards. Or no, I just did it twice. That's why. This is correct. So you do have to have energy being added here. It was this one. This, where energy is released, this is exothermic. Remember, we also defined an exergonic. The same way we do exothermic. If you're in AP Chem or you go into AP Bio, you'll learn a slightly different thing going on there. It has to do with the organization of the molecules. But if you're going from ADP plus phosphate to ATP plus water, that does also require energy being put in. So this would also require plus energy, which makes this reaction of ADP plus phosphate plus energy endothermic. Thermic. Okay, which is also we defined as endergonic. Again, it has to do with how the molecules are arranged at the end. But the big point is you're taking in energy as a reactant on this side. You're releasing it as a product on this when you're breaking down ATP. So this must be exothermic. This one is endothermic. Yeah, it probably seems like a lot, but it didn't take long to go through it all. Hopefully this makes a lot more sense. But that's all we've done so far. It's been a lot, but you guys have really done a good job of putting it all together. And I don't think you should stress too much about the quiz. Just make sure you know your 3 steps, what goes into each one, what comes out of each one. The difference between being anaerobic and just aerobic is very important. What's the deciding factor of what you're going to do, where you're going to do it. And make sure you understand how ATP is used and how it's formed. Bye!